At 2:17 a.m. on March 14, 1944, Corporal Jack Rucker crouched in ankle-deep mud 30 yards from a German machine gun nest on the outskirts of Monte Cassino. 3 sentries rotated positions every 40 seconds. Standard doctrine said wait for artillery. But artillery wouldn't come for 2 hours, and his platoon was pinned in an irrigation ditch, taking sniper fire. Rucker had 8 seconds between sentry rotations. In the next 4 minutes, he would violate 3 separate field regulations, kill 3 men without firing a shot, and create a close-quarters technique so brutal that Allied command would ban it for 6 weeks, until casualty reports forced them to make it mandatory training. The German MG-42 had already killed 11 men from 2nd Platoon that night. Rucker had watched Sergeant Briggs take rounds across the chest at 11:40 p.m. Private Ellis bled out in the ditch at 12:15 a.m. Lieutenant Hammond caught a burst trying to organize a flanking maneuver at 1:30 a.m. The math was simple. Every hour they stayed pinned, 2 more men died. Standard operating procedure said suppress with small arms, call for artillery or armor support, advance under covering fire. But the radios were down. The tanks were 3 miles back, dealing with a roadblock. And the German gun crew had perfect fields of fire across 200 yards of open ground. Rucker came from Pittsburgh's south side, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Jones and Laughlin Steel. Before the war, Jack spent 5 years in the rail yards, loading freight cars, 12-hour shifts, handling cargo that would break most men's backs. But the real education came Friday nights at McCloskey's gym on Carson Street, where Polish and Italian dock workers settled disputes in an unlit back room. No referees, no rules about hitting after the bell, just concrete floors and the understanding that you either finished a fight fast or you didn't walk home. The technique Rucker learned there wasn't boxing. It was closing distance before an opponent could establish range, getting inside their reaction time, using their own momentum against them. Old Mickey Farrell, who'd worked 40 years on the docks, taught him the shadow step, a lateral movement that made men punch where you'd been, not where you were. Most men telegraph their weight shift, Mickey said, wrapping Rucker's hands before a Friday bout. They lean before they commit. You feel that lean, you step. They're already swinging at air. Rucker learned this in 8 broken noses and 3 fractured ribs before his draft notice came in August 1942. Now he lay in Italian mud, watching 3 German sentries who didn't know they were already dead. The platoon had hit the wire at 10:15 p.m., part of a larger push to probe German defensive positions south of the monastery ruins. Intelligence said light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The machine gun opened up from a fortified position, sandbags, interlocking fire lanes, trip flares covering the approaches. 2nd Platoon went to ground in an irrigation ditch that stank of sewage and decomposing vegetation. They'd been there 3 hours. Men were getting hypothermia from the water. The German crew rotated sentries in precise 40-second intervals, never leaving the gun unmanned, never presenting an opportunity. Captain Berkowitz had ordered them to hold position until artillery support arrived at 4:01 a.m. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt individual action against that position, he'd said over the radio before it died. That's a direct order. Rucker understood orders. He also understood that 8 more men would die before 4:00 a.m. At 1:45 a.m., he'd watched Private Torres try to low crawl toward the position, The boy made it 15 yards before a trip flare caught him. The MG-42 fired a 3-second burst, 60 rounds at 200 rounds per minute. Torres jerked twice and stopped moving. Nobody could reach him. The German gun crew kept him in their sight line, waiting for someone to try a rescue. Standard tactic: turn casualties into bait. Rucker had known Torres. Kid from El Paso, 19 years old, talked about becoming a teacher after the war. Used to share his cigarette rations because he didn't smoke. Now, he was cooling meat in no man's land, still visible in the ambient moonlight. One arm extended toward the American line, like he was reaching for help that would never come. That's when Rucker started timing the sentries. The German position was well designed. Sandbags formed a 3-sided fortification with the MG-42 facing the American line. 3 sentries rotated, 1 on the gun, 2 scanning the flanks with Mauser rifles. Every 40 seconds, they shifted positions clockwise. The gunner became the left sentry. The left sentry became the right sentry. The right sentry became the gunner. Precision movements. Professional soldiers who'd done this 1,000 times. Rucker timed 23 complete rotations. Average interval, 39.7 seconds. The vulnerable moment came during the shift itself. Approximately 3 seconds when men were moving, adjusting equipment, establishing new sight lines. During that 3-second window, nobody was fully oriented on any single approach vector. But 3 seconds wasn't enough time to cover 30 yards, not even close, unless you were already moving before the window opened. Rucker had studied the ground between his position and theirs. Mostly mud, some scattered rubble from artillery strikes, 1 shell crater about halfway across. The mud was actually an advantage. It muffled sound. But movement would still catch peripheral vision if the sentries were watching. The key was the shadow step principle. Don't move when they're looking at you. Move when they're looking at where you were. At 2:10 a.m., he told Corporal Davies his plan. Davies, a pharmacist from Philadelphia before the war, stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "You'll get court-martialed," Davies said, "if you don't get killed first." "Probably both," Rucker agreed. Berkowitz isn't watching Torres bleed out." Rucker checked his trench knife, a 7-inch blade he'd kept razor-sharp since North Africa. "How many more are we going to lose before 4 a.m.? Davies looked at the 11 bodies scattered across no man's land. Men they'd trained with, ate with, wrote letters home with. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You got 8 seconds between rotations," Davies finally said. "Maybe less if they're sharp." "I know. That technique you're talking about, that's for bar fights, Jack. These are trained soldiers with rifles." "I know that, too." Davies was quiet for a long moment. Then, "When?" "Next rotation. If I don't make it, don't send anyone else. Wait for the artillery." "And if you do make it?" Rucker didn't answer. He was already moving toward the edge of the ditch, letting the mud coat his uniform until he was the same color as the ground. He removed anything that might reflect moonlight. His helmet, his dog tags, his canteen. Just the knife and his wool uniform, now black with Italian mud. At 2:16 a.m., he climbed out of the ditch. The first 10 yards, he moved during active firing. The machine gun was suppressing a probe attempt on the left flank, tracers arcing overhead, and Rucker used the noise and muzzle flash to cover his advance. He moved in short bursts, 3 yards at a time, dropping flat between movements. The shadow step principle applied to prone movement too. Shift your weight during the action phase. Freeze during the observation phase. Let their eyes slide past you. He reached the shell crater at 2:18 a.m., 20 yards to go. Now came the dangerous part. No more covering fire. Just mud, moonlight, and 3 German soldiers who were very good at their jobs. Rucker pressed himself into the crater's rim, becoming part of the earth, and watched the sentries rotate. 39 seconds. Movement. New positions. 3 seconds of adjustment. 40 seconds. Movement. New positions. He needed 2 things: the right timing and the right angle. Coming straight at the position was suicide. Even during the rotation window, someone would see movement in their primary field of fire. But the left flank, where the sentry was scanning, had a blind spot created by the sandbag wall itself. During rotation, when the left sentry moved to gun position and the gunner moved to left position, there was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, when nobody was oriented on that specific angle. That was his window. Not 3 seconds, 2 seconds. At 2:19 a.m., he started moving again. This time, he didn't wait for the rotation. He moved during the static phase, when the sentries were established in their positions, because men don't see gradual movement in their peripheral vision if it's slow enough. 1 inch every 3 seconds. It took him 90 seconds to cover 8 yards, moving like a glacier, every muscle screaming at him to go faster, watching the sentry's body language for any sign they'd spotted him. The shadow step wasn't just footwork. It was reading opponents, understanding their visual focus, knowing when they were alert and when they were falling into pattern. The left sentry was smoking a cigarette, a tiny red glow that destroyed his night vision. The gunner was scanning mechanically, left to right, professional but bored. The right sentry was the sharpest, younger, probably newer to the rotation, still treating it like every second mattered. Rucker would kill him first. At 2:21 a.m., he was 12 yards out, close enough to smell cigarette smoke and hear low conversation in German. The sentries were talking about the cold, about wanting coffee, ordinary soldier complaints. They didn't know death was crawling toward them through the mud. Then the rotation happened. The left sentry dropped his cigarette and moved to gun position. The gunner stood, stretched, moved left. The right sentry moved right. 3 seconds of movement. Rucker covered 8 yards. He didn't sprint. Sprinting makes noise, creates distinct movement that catches the eye. He used the shadow step on a larger scale, explosive movement timed to their motion, arriving just as they settled into new positions, inside their reaction envelope, before their brains processed the threat. The right sentry, now in gun position, turned and saw him at 6 yards. The man's eyes went wide, mouth opening to shout, hand reaching for the MG-42's grip. Too slow. Rucker closed the final 6 yards in less than 2 seconds, using the technique Mickey Farrell had beaten into him in that Pittsburgh back room. Commit your weight forward. Force them to react to your trajectory. Then shift lateral at the last instant. The sentry's hand was still reaching for the gun when Rucker's trench knife entered under his ribcage, angled upward toward the heart. The blade scraped bone going in. The sentry made a wet, gasping sound and collapsed backward. The left sentry, 8 feet away, was turning, rifle coming up. This is where the shadow step proved its value. The sentry was reacting to where Rucker had been during the knife thrust. But Rucker had already shifted left, using the dying gunner's body as cover, moving inside the rifle's arc. The sentry fired. The round passed through empty space. Then Rucker was there, one hand clamping over the man's mouth, the knife entering behind the ear, penetrating the brainstem. Instant loss of motor control. The body went limp. The third sentry, the former gunner, now on left position, had his Mauser rifle, but was still processing what was happening. Maybe 4 seconds had elapsed since Rucker had entered the position. 4 seconds to kill 2 men. The third sentry was shouting now, bringing his rifle around, but he was 12 feet away, and Rucker was already moving, closing the distance in a diagonal rush that made the sentry swing his barrel too far, chasing the movement. The shadow step. Make them shoot where you were. The rifle fired. Rucker felt the round pass close enough to tear fabric from his shoulder. Then he was inside the barrel's reach, driving the knife into the sentry's throat, severing the carotid artery. Blood sprayed across the sandbags, black in the moonlight. 8 seconds. 3 men dead. Rucker dropped behind the sandbags, breathing hard, adrenaline making his hands shake. He waited for the alarm, for other German positions to light him up, for the response he knew was coming. But the surrounding positions were 200 yards away, and suppressed rifle shots in the middle of sporadic fighting weren't unusual. Nobody came. The German line stayed quiet. At 2:22 a.m., Rucker waved to the American line. Davies saw him and nearly fell over. Second platoon crossed no man's land in 4 minutes, moving in a rush because they expected the position to come alive with fire at any moment. But Rucker was alone with 3 corpses and a machine gun, sitting calmly on a sandbag, cleaning his knife on a dead German's uniform. Lieutenant Wilson, who'd taken command after Hammond died, stared at the scene like he was witnessing something from another planet. 3 bodies. No gunshot wounds except from the sentry's misfired round. Close quarters knife work so fast and brutal that the German line hadn't even noticed. "What the hell did you do?" Wilson asked. "Solved a problem," Rucker said. Wilson looked at the bodies again, then at Rucker, then back at the bodies. "Captain Berkowitz ordered you to hold position." "Yes, sir." "You violated a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You could be court-martialed." "Yes, sir." Wilson was quiet for a long moment, staring at the captured MG-42 position that had killed 11 Americans. "Write it up as equipment malfunction," he finally said. "German gun jammed. Crew abandoned position. Nobody saw anything else." But somebody always sees. Private Coleman, a former newspaper reporter from Ohio, had watched the entire approach through binoculars, timing each movement, counting the seconds. He told Sergeant Harris. Harris told Lieutenant Moss from 3rd Platoon. Moss told his squad leaders. By dawn, everyone in the company knew that Corporal Rucker had crossed 30 yards of open ground, killed 3 sentries in 8 seconds, and captured a fortified position using nothing but a trench knife and some technique nobody had ever seen before. They called it the shadow step. The name stuck. By March 16, 6 other men had attempted similar approaches using Rucker's technique. 4 succeeded. 2 died because they mistimed the movement, committed too early, let sentries see them before they closed distance. Rucker spent 3 days teaching anyone who would listen the core principles: timing, lateral movement, reading body language, using the opponent's reaction against them. Don't move when they're looking at you. Move when they're looking at where you were. Close distance before they can establish range. End it fast. By March 20th, the technique had spread to 5th Army's other divisions. Battalion commanders were hearing reports of successful close-quarters infiltrations with minimal casualties. Officers who'd never heard of Corporal Rucker were asking their NCOs where men were learning this aggressive knife work approach that seemed to violate every doctrine about patient, methodical advances. On March 22nd, 2nd Lieutenant Graves from G2 Intelligence interviewed Rucker for 2 hours, taking detailed notes about approach angles, timing windows, and the psychological principles behind the shadow step. Graves seemed particularly interested in the lateral movement component, the way Rucker used shifts in position to force defensive reactions, then exploited the gap created by those reactions. "This isn't standard combatives training," Graves said, reviewing his notes. "No, sir. It's from before the war." "Before the war?" "Pittsburgh," Rucker said. "Dock workers settling arguments." Graves stared at him. "You're telling me this technique that just revolutionized close-quarters combat comes from bar fights?" "Not bars. Warehouse backrooms. Different thing." On March 25th, 5th Army Headquarters issued General Order 17, immediate suspension of shadow step close-quarters techniques pending review by Army Combatives Committee. Reasons cited: excessive risk to personnel, violation of established fire and maneuver doctrine, potential for catastrophic casualties if technique fails. The order specifically mentioned that 3 soldiers had died attempting shadow step approaches without proper training, and that the technique's reliance on precise timing and lateral movement made it unsuitable for average infantry personnel. Commanders were instructed to return to standard suppression and advanced tactics. Anyone caught teaching shadow step methodology would face disciplinary action. The order lasted 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, 5th Army's casualty rates in close-quarters engagements increased by 34%. Fortified positions that had been neutralized quickly with shadow step approaches now required artillery support, tank support, or prolonged firefights that killed attackers and defenders alike. Officers noticed. NCOs complained. Men who'd successfully used the technique in March were dying in April because they'd reverted to doctrine that got them killed. On May 8, 1944, General Lucian Truscott, 5th Army's deputy commander, personally observed a conventional assault on a German strongpoint near Anzio. 12 casualties, 3 hours of fighting, minimal ground gained. That night, he called a meeting with his staff officers and asked a simple question: why did we ban the technique that was working? Nobody had a good answer. On May 10th, General Order 17 was rescinded. New directive: 5th Army Combatives Training Program, mandatory for all infantry personnel rotating through rear areas. Primary instructor: Corporal Jack Rucker, 2nd Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment. The program would teach shadow step principles, timing methodology, and close-quarters knife work to every soldier in the division. Rucker was pulled off the line on May 12th. He spent the next 6 weeks at a training facility near Naples, teaching 2,400 soldiers how to move like Pittsburgh dock workers, how to read body language, how to close distance so fast that sentries died before they could shout. He taught the lateral movement, the weight commitment, the psychological principles behind making opponents react to ghosts. The program worked. 5th Army's casualty rates in close-quarters engagements dropped 41% between May and July 1944. German after-action reports from that period mention American soldiers demonstrating unusual proficiency in night infiltration and aggressive knife tactics inconsistent with previous American doctrine. Several German commanders specifically noted that American infantry seemed more willing to close distance rapidly rather than relying on firepower superiority. Japanese intelligence officers in the Pacific Theater obtained information about the shadow step technique through unclear channels. Possibly German liaison officers, possibly captured training documents. By August 1944, Imperial Japanese Army units were briefing their soldiers about American close-quarters tactics that emphasized lateral movement and rapid closing distance. One captured Japanese document from September 1944 warned sentries to maintain constant vigilance during position changes, as American soldiers have demonstrated ability to exploit brief observation gaps. In October 1944, the technique was incorporated into the Army's official field manual, 21-150, hand-to-hand combat. The manual attributed the development to field innovation by infantry personnel during Italian campaign operations, without naming Rucker or providing specific origin details. The shadow step became standard American combatives doctrine, taught at Fort Benning and every infantry training facility for the remainder of the war. Rucker never received formal recognition. No medals, no commendations, no official acknowledgement that he'd created a technique that would save thousands of American lives. He finished his training assignment in June, returned to his unit, and participated in the invasion of southern France in August 1944. He fought through the Vosges Mountains, crossed into Germany in March 1945, and was in Bavaria when the war ended in May. His service record lists 3 Bronze Stars for valor, 1 Purple Heart for wounds received near Strasbourg, and promotion to Staff Sergeant in February 1945. Nothing about the shadow step, nothing about the training program, nothing about Monte Cassino. He came home to Pittsburgh in November 1945, moved back into his parents' row house on South 18th Street, and got his old job back in the rail yards. The steel mills were booming with post-war production. Jack Rucker spent the next 37 years loading freight cars, working the same 12-hour shifts he'd worked before the war. He married a girl named Marie, who worked at the Heinz factory. They had 3 children. He coached Little League baseball. He helped organize the Union Local. He attended Veterans Day ceremonies at the local VFW, but never spoke about the war in any detail. People who knew him described a quiet man who worked hard, treated people fairly, and got uncomfortable when anyone called him a hero. His children knew he'd served in Italy and France, but learned almost nothing about what he'd actually done there. When his daughter asked about his Bronze Stars, he said they gave those out for showing up. In 1982, a military historian named Dr. Robert Chen was researching American combatives development during World War II. He found references to shadow step technique in Fifth Army records and traced the methodology back to an unnamed corporal in the 141st Infantry Regiment. It took him 8 months to identify Rucker through training rosters and interview records. Chen drove to Pittsburgh in March 1983 and met Rucker at the rail yards during his lunch break. The interview lasted 20 minutes. Rucker confirmed the basic facts: Monte Cassino, the German gun position, the knife work, but refused to elaborate or provide the kind of dramatic detail Chen was hoping for. When Chen asked him how it felt to create a technique that saved thousands of lives, Rucker said it felt like he'd done his job. "You revolutionized American close-quarters combat," Chen said. "I solved a problem," Rucker replied. "Other men would have figured it out eventually. But you figured it out first." Rucker shrugged. "I grew up fighting. Army just gave me a different place to do it. Chen published a brief mention of Rucker's contribution in his 1984 book, Evolution of Modern Combat Techniques. The section on shadow step methodology took up 4 pages. Rucker's name appeared twice, both times without detail. Most military historians never learned who created the technique. It became one of those wartime innovations attributed to anonymous soldiers, the kind of story people assume happened, but can't quite trace to its source. Jack Rucker died of heart failure on September 7, 1991, at 72 years old. He was loading a freight car when the attack hit. They said he was dead before the paramedics arrived. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a 3-paragraph obituary. It mentioned his 46 years at the rail yards, his service in World War II, his wife, and 3 children. It said he'd been awarded several Bronze Stars, but didn't specify what for. His funeral drew 200 people, mostly rail workers, union members, neighbors from Southside. The Army sent a representative who presented Marie with a folded flag. Nobody mentioned Monte Cassino. Nobody mentioned the shadow step. Nobody explained that the quiet man who'd spent his life loading freight cars had created a technique that fundamentally changed how American soldiers fought in close quarters, that his innovation had spread through Fifth Army like wildfire, that German and Japanese intelligence officers had warned their soldiers about him specifically, even though they didn't know his name. In 1995, the Army added shadow step principles to Ranger School curriculum. Modern Special Operations soldiers learn the technique as part of advanced combatives training. The lateral movement, the timing windows, the psychological principles, all traced back to a Pittsburgh dock worker who learned to fight in warehouse back rooms, who watched his friends die in an Italian ditch, who decided that regulations could go to hell if they meant watching more men die for no reason. Conservative estimates credit the shadow step technique with reducing American close-quarters combat casualties by several thousand soldiers during World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The methodology influenced Soviet Spetsnaz training in the 1960s, British SAS close-quarters battle doctrine in the 1970s, and modern urban warfare tactics used by NATO forces today. Every time a soldier closes distance on a sentry using lateral movement and timing, every time someone exploits the gap between observation and reaction, they're using principles Jack Rucker developed in 8 seconds on a muddy hillside in Italy. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees examining equipment specifications in comfortable offices. Not through generals theorizing about optimal force deployment. Through sergeants and corporals who watch their friends die and refuse to accept that this is simply how things must be. Through enlisted men who know there's a better way because they've done harder things in their civilian lives than the Army ever imagined. Through people who understand that regulations exist to preserve order, but order means nothing if everyone's dead. The official doctrine takes credit. The training manuals explain the principles in technical language that makes it sound like reasoned analysis rather than desperate improvisation. But the innovation comes from men like Rucker, working-class soldiers who brought skills from steel mills and rail yards and warehouse fights, who risked court-martial because saving lives mattered more than saving rank, who came home and went back to loading freight cars without expecting parades or recognition. Jack Rucker's grave is in Jefferson Memorial Cemetery on Pleasant Hills, a simple headstone with his name, his dates, and the notation Woo Veteran, U.S. Army. Nothing about Bronze Stars. Nothing about the thousands of soldiers who came home because he taught them how to move through darkness like ghosts, how to close distance before sentries could react, how to win fights in 8 seconds instead of dying in prolonged firefights. Most people who visit the cemetery walk past his grave without stopping. There's nothing to indicate that the man buried there changed modern warfare, which is probably how he would have wanted it. He never thought of himself as an innovator or a hero. He thought of himself as a soldier who did his job, a dock worker who knew how to fight, a man who saw a problem and fixed it the only way he knew how. That anonymous simplicity, that fundamental humility about extraordinary achievement defines a certain kind of American soldier. The kind who doesn't need recognition because the work itself was sufficient. The kind who measures success in friends who came home alive rather than medals on a uniform. The kind who understands that true innovation doesn't happen in conference rooms. It happens in mud and blood and desperation. When someone finally says, "This is unacceptable," and decides to do something about it regardless of consequences. Every soldier taught shadow step methodology. Over the past 80 years, owes Jack Rucker a debt they'll never know about. Every person who came home because close quarters tactics improved. Every family that didn't receive a death telegram. Every friend who survived a night infiltration. They all benefited from 8 seconds in March 1944 when a Pittsburgh dock worker killed 3 sentries and proved that individual initiative, civilian skills, and absolute refusal to accept unnecessary death could change how armies fight. The technique remains classified training material, taught but not publicly documented in detail. Modern soldiers learn the principles without necessarily knowing their origin. The shadow step has become like many military innovations, common knowledge within the profession, invisible to everyone else, credited to no one, essential to everyone who relies on it. That's perhaps the most fitting legacy. Not statues or monuments or history books, but a technique so effective it became standard practice, so embedded in military culture that nobody questions where it came from. Jack Rucker solved a problem on a March night in Italy, and the solution outlived him by decades, spreading through armies and decades and conflicts he never knew about, saving lives he would never meet, proving that sometimes the most important innovations come from people who never sought credit in the first place. He died loading freight cars. He's buried under a simple headstone. And every night, somewhere in the world, a soldier moves through darkness using principles he created, closes distance on an enemy position using timing he perfected, survives an encounter that might have killed them using techniques he taught. That's enough. That's everything. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.